All right. Well, welcome back. This is a real quick refresher if you've already forgotten, and it's been a bit of a day. So, I think I may have forgotten. That is Tom Reesing. I am Christopher Harrison. This is, as you see right there, Developing SharePoint Server Advanced Solutions. So we've covered already, taken a look at MMS. We've taken a look at search. So what do you say you take it away with a little bit of BCS?
All right, BCS, another TLA, Business Connectivity Services. Thank you, Christopher. You've done all the hard work so far today. It's about time for me to do something, huh?
Yeah, I agree. Right. All right, so I'm just going to sit over here and I'm just going to take a nap.
Well,
so actually,
if you could motivate the hamsters on my server a little bit,
okay,
I'd appreciate it if they spun a little faster than the hamsters on your server.
Okay, all right, yeah, let's do that. Okay. In the meantime,
feed them some carrots or something. I don't know.
Have at it.
All right. So today I'm going to talk to you about business connectivity services. And business connectivity services comes from a long line of services to SharePoint going back to SharePoint 2007. And it was really greatly improved in 2010. And then now in 2013 we have a bunch of new features as well. And I'll be talking about some of those today. Let me show you what we're going to talk about. First, we're going to start with the BDC model. I'm going to take a look at one of those and show you how to create one. Then we are going to talk about the external content type. These are both very important parts of business connectivity services, and I'll have a demo there with external content types. And last, we'll talk about the new external events and notification system within SharePoint 2013, totally new. Couldn't do it in 2010, and it's good stuff. So when we talk about SharePoint 2013 and the business connectivity services, we're looking at something else here called the BDC. Now, Christopher, you may have heard of the BDC before, right?
Yep. We had data connectivity.
Yeah, we had BDC in 2007, right?
We did.
Do you remember that?
Yep, I do.
Yeah, but it was a different BDC.
Yeah, it was and not a whole lot of fun to set up and configure.
Oh yes, absolutely. So one of the funny things I think, if you look back in the terminology, if you're searching through TechNet or MSDN and you come across the business data catalog, you'll know that you're looking at documentation written for SharePoint 2007, because with the introduction of the business connectivity services in SharePoint 2010, they actually changed the last C in the BDC. The BDC in 2007 was the business data catalog. Now the business data connectivity is what is behind the business connectivity services in SharePoint 2010. Business data connectivity defines this model that we use in BCS. And if you're looking here at the, this is something new in Visual Studio with the BDC models. You can see a designer surface where in previous versions of SharePoint, we had to do this all by hand or with a third-party app or with SharePoint Designer. Now we've actually got some BDC model designer surface to look at our models with. And you can see there, there's three different parts. You've got the Explorer that shows up near on the right-hand side near the Solution Explorer. You've got the BDC model designer surface, similar to, if you're designing an ASPX page and you're dragging things on there from the toolbar. And we've got the details down at the bottom. Now, if we dive a little deeper into the schema of what we have available to us in Visual Studio, you can see that we can drill down into the entities defined in the model, and I'll show you a little bit more about that as we get into the demo. Before, what I was showing you was the visual display, right? What we get in Visual Studio now. What I'm showing you here is just a little insight into what's behind that. And it's all XML configuration files. And as Christopher was saying with SharePoint 2007, some of us got intimately familiar with the XML.
Yeah, you'll actually, if you take a look at the XML file there, you'll actually notice that you can see the command that's being executed. You can see the parameter for the ID in that case. You can actually see the object that's going to be used. You can see the type of database or the type of object inside of the database, the schema that's being used, etc. So you can actually see it all there. But what's nice is we don't actually necessarily have to get in and work with the XML directly anymore.
And you know what? I think one of the funny things about this, Christopher, is if XML wasn't scary enough, right? Because what is, you look at this and you're like, well, it's not C# code, right? So to some developers, it's kind of, and there's certainly no end users or admins really want to look at this either. So they're like, oh, that's developer stuff, right? But as I've been talking about business connectivity services and the previous business data catalog over the years, I've found that a lot of developers actually are scared of, where did I go?
Every time you touch, it's just going to advance a slide, so use the cursor. No, use your... Oh, there you go.
Yeah, this
There we
fancy...
go.
Can you put that... Can you slap up that name of this thing again that I'm using here? Oh, okay, all right. No, that's all right. So I've got a very fancy touch screen here. It's high-tech, right? Which means... I don't know how to use the Planner PCT 27-inch touchscreen monitor yet.
There you go.
But I'm getting used to it, right?
By the way, do you want to hide the picture-in-picture for just a second there? Just because it's... there you go. Yeah, we got a couple of real quick requests for that in the chat.
So I just want to highlight this right here, right? Some people might recognize this part of the screen as a SQL query, right? I've found over the years that really scares some developers, right? That's in the domain of the DBA, right?
All right.
And honestly, it scares some DBAs that developers are looking at that, right?
Yes.
So you'll see in a lot of the examples that, where we're automatically generating these schema files. I'm going to do it a couple different ways, one through Visual Studio and one through SharePoint Designer. You'll see these direct queries to the database being generated and stored in the BDC models. But actually, in best practice, you might rather use a view or a stored procedure. And that's where you make, actually, I've found most developers and most DBAs more comfortable, right? Because the DBAs can write and author the views and the stored procedures, and they can control the permissions on them, which is very important to DBAs as well, right? And then the developers never have to look at the SQL. All right. So now I'm going to show you how you can connect to an OData data source from Visual Studio. This is something that's brand new in SharePoint 2013, both the OData data source and the model generation from Visual Studio for an OData data source. You can only do this in Visual Studio, so I'll show you later how you can create one for SQL Server in SharePoint Designer, and you can only do that in SharePoint Designer. But right now, let's get right into Visual Studio. We're going to do a demo now.
There we go.
Yeah. Okay, but it's a live demo on my, I'm not going to a VM. So I'm going to do this against SharePoint Online and Office 365.
Okay.
So I don't have to RDP into a SharePoint server to do this.
No. So in other words, what you're doing right now, just to sort of make this perfectly clear, you've just got Visual Studio installed on your local system. You don't have SharePoint there, nothing else, just Visual Studio, and away you're going to go.
Isn't that awesome? It's like Nirvana for SharePoint developers, right? Because all these years, going back 9, 10 years of SharePoint development I've been doing, I originally struggled with that when my mentor told me 10 years ago, you've got to run this on a server. I said, are you crazy? No, I work on Windows, right? And he's like, no, you need to run it on Windows Server because that's the only place you can compile code for SharePoint, right? Finally, now we're in the era, 2013, we can compile apps for SharePoint and create BDC models from Visual Studio straight from our productivity system without having to be running on a server.
Which is fantastic.
So I think you may have seen this before. I can't remember if Christopher did one of these demos yet today, but he did, I know, in the previous Microsoft Virtual Academy for the core solutions, which is I'm going to create a SharePoint app.
Yep.
And this is something that's also new for SharePoint 2013, the fact that you can do an app-scoped BDC model, right? I'm going to call this my OData BCS SharePoint app. And you can see up here in my URL that I'm connecting to a subdomain of SharePoint.com. SharePoint.com is where all of the Office 365 SharePoint Online instances are stored, unless you have your own vanity URL up there. I could make this possibly SharePoint.tomreesing.com instead of tomreesing.sharepoint.com, and actually it's something I've been considering. And under that, I've got a developer site. So that's always necessary for working with apps while you're in the development mode. You want to have a developer site collection. It's a special site collection new to SharePoint 2013, and it's especially for the development of the apps. Now, when you finally deploy the app, it doesn't have to be deployed to a developer site. You can use an app catalog or the App Store. But for development purposes, you always want to target one of these developer site collections, and I've got one there in the URL. I'm choosing this SharePoint hosted model, and that's what I'll do most of my demos on today. I'm sure if you want to learn more about the other two models, you can watch the core solutions.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, myself and John Galloway.
Yes.
So, yeah.
Very good. All right, so...
And there was a lot of spaghetti there. Actually, no, I'm sorry, that was a different one that I did. And it was...
Chris Johnson was it? Yeah.
Yeah, Chris Johnson. Yeah, it wasn't John Galloway. Sorry, I did another one. After a while, they all run together.
Yes.
So, yes, there was no spaghetti in that one. It was Chris Johnson. So, in any event,
here we are in Visual Studio, and we've got a default ASPX created there, and we can see a couple other things in the app, right? These are pretty standard things. We've got CSS that controls the visual display. We've got a PNG that is going to show up as the app selection, and we've got this app.js, right? I'll talk about some of those more as I do some other demos, but for right now, what I want to show you is in the Add drop-down menu, you've got your normal New Item and Existing Item options. But if you want to connect to an OData data source, you don't want to choose one of those, right? I made the mistake. You can look forever, and you'll never find OData or external data sources under New Item. It's right here down under Content Types for External Data Source. It's kind of a special hidden option.
Yeah. Well, sort of both hidden and not hidden. I mean, it's just right out there in the open, yeah.
So I'm going to paste a URL in there. You can see I'm at odata.org, which has a bunch of example OData data services for us to consume. Mm-hmm. And I'm just going to name it OData. And I am going to choose the...
Now, the OData source that you're using, what is that? Where is that?
So this is a service, promoting OData, the standard, right?
Okay.
It's odata.org.
Okay.
Right, and they've got example OData sources for you to connect to.
Oh, nice. All right, so you're just connecting out to somebody else's OData, not something that you've implemented.
Absolutely.
Very cool.
In this case, there's other ways, right?
Sure.
And so now you can see what happens is added to my solution here, my app in Visual Studio, is a new external content types section and an OData folder, which is what I told it to name it, and then this new products entity, which is part of my BDC model, right? And if I do an F5 deploy, you can see that what's going to happen here is the BDC model is going to be generated from the OData data source. The entity is going to be in there, and that's going to be wrapped up into a WSP, a solution package, and deployed to my SharePoint Online developer site as an app. And when that happens, I'll get that standard GUID, right? The generated URL right here that we can see right there, and it's going to launch it here in my browser. And what we're seeing here is the result of the default.aspx. The list, an external list, was also created here, and I can navigate to that by typing it into the browser here. What did I forget which entity I chose. Do you remember? I think it was products.
Yes.
So what's happening here is these names and categories and descriptions, those are all being pulled down from an OData data source. You can see I've got sorting and filtering, right? If I only want to see the up conversion DVD player, I can filter to that, or I can clear that off, right? And all this data is external to SharePoint, right? Isn't that cool?
Yeah, that really is. So what's happened here, and for those of you who've done BCS with 2010, what you're able to do is very easily connect out to a database, pull all that in, make it appear like it was inside of SharePoint, even though it actually wasn't. Now what you've done with just going in, a couple of little right clicks, a couple of little checkboxes, and poof, now you're pulling in an OData source from somewhere else, and you've actually done that inside SharePoint Online.
Isn't that amazing?
That is amazing. That's extremely cool.
So if I go and I look at what we compiled here, we've got a WSP, right? And we know that if we change that to a cab, right, we can peek inside and we can see the standard things you're used to seeing in an app. We've got, the app.cs, app.js, but we've also got a BDC model right in there.
Nice.
Isn't that awesome?
Yeah, that's fantastic.
So I can extract that, pull that out here, and if I know how to use WinZip, extract to here. Yeah. There we go. And I can drag that into to Visual Studio. And it can't find the file specified. That's funny. Let's try that again. Is it really there? I think it's there. Well, that's fine. Oh, no, it's not. Did it go away? Oh. Let's try that again, a different way. This time, I'm going to, instead of the F5 deploy, which actually has a little bit of magic going on it, I'm going to just go to the build solution.
Okay.
I think what happened was when I stopped the debugger,
yeah, it kills everything.
Actually destroyed the WSP? No? Huh? Am I making this up? Untip. Oh, it's still there. Right. Well, I'll tell you what. I will look at it with Notepad++.
There you go. Done deal.
Here we are. Here's a BDC model. Right?
I'm disappointed that you didn't fire up VI for that.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Emacs. Yeah.
There we go.
So here you can see, and let's see, I've got a setting here in, I won't even bother with that, never mind. I could change this so it's pretty printed in Notepad++, but yeah, whatever.
Yeah,
we get the idea,
we
right?
see the XML,
so
yeah.
Here it is. This is, and you can tell by scrolling through here, this is quite something that you would not want to have to generate by hand, right?
Right.
You're very thankful for that. But one of the nice things about this is now that you have your BDC model created, you can go in and you can modify it, right? So you could change if it generated a now this is an OData web service, right? So we've got a level of abstraction between whatever the data source is, if it's a SQL Server database already, right? So we don't need to go to views and stored procedures here. But if this was a case where it was a SQL Server straight against SQL Server, you could do that. You could go in there and you could change the SQL query to a stored procedure instead of a direct query if you wanted, for example, would be one of the things you could do.
Nice.
Also, you might find that there's certain things that you can do in the XML file that you can't do in the designer.
Okay.
Right? Okay, so that's an example of connecting to an OData data source. Just a couple of things I want to point out about that. You can also like I said, you can do it manually. But that's the automatic version. So,
yeah, throw your there you go.
So great. So that's a basic rundown of the BDC model from the overview level and a quick run through of how you can generate a BDC model through Visual Studio. Now I want to dig a little bit deeper into the pieces of the BDC model. So there's an external content type that's inside the external system. The external system is also known as the BDC model, right? Inside the BDC model, you have an external content type. The external system defines things like the URL for the OData service in that case, or for SQL Server, the name of the SQL Server and how you're going to connect to it. The external content type, however, is much more similar to a regular SharePoint content type, like a document content type, like we were talking about in some previous modules. Except the external content type is really defining a mapping between columns in an external list, for example, in SharePoint, and the fields in SQL Server that they'll be referring to, or the other data source you might use. So you've got this hierarchy coming here. You've got the BDC model, also known as the external system. You've got inside the BDC model an external content type that has methods defined within it. And then that external content type, once stored in SharePoint or either in the configuration database or in the app model instance, you can use that to build things like external lists. We saw one example of an external list already, and we'll see another one coming up. You can also use it in an external data column, which is a lot like a lookup to an external data source instead of a lookup to another list in SharePoint. And as Christopher said earlier, everything in SharePoint...
Everything is a list.
Everything's a list.
Everything is a list.
Even an
you
external
learn nothing else about SharePoint. Everything's a list. And SharePoint's an ASP.NET application. Those are the two things. You learn those, that's it. The rest falls into place. Piece of cake. Piece of cake.
All right, now I love demos, so I'm going to jump back into another demo, and this time I'm going to go to my VM. So I'm going to switch over from slides to the VM. And in this case, the reason that I'm using a VM is because the data source I'm connecting to is a local database. I've imported this into my SQL Server. You can see it here in Microsoft SQL Server Management Studio. It's a little bit small. But anyway, I've got some tables and some views there. If we run one of these in the query analyzer, you can just see, we've got some results. I got 1,000 rows there for U.S. cities, right? Now, to connect to automatically generate an external content type for a SQL Server data source, you want to use SharePoint Designer. Again, it's going to generate a BDC model file like the one we saw for the OData data source created from Visual Studio. But in this case, the tool of choice is SharePoint Designer. This isn't changed from SharePoint 2010. It's very similar if you've seen it before, but I'm going to walk you through it real quick. So you open SharePoint Designer and you browse to your site, and then you go to the external content types area and you click on new external content type. Give it a name like MVA, BCS, and define your external system. You can see here that I've already added a connection to my database, but if I were to go through and do it again, I would hit Add Connection, and I have my choice of a .NET type, which is a custom connector you can build in Visual Studio, a SQL Server source, which we can connect to directly from SharePoint Designer, or a WCF service. In my case, I connected directly to a SQL Server, and I typed in the name and the database name and shows how to do the authentication, right? Once I did that, I have the tables and the views, just like we saw in SQL Server Enterprise Manager. It's not called that anymore, but the SQL Server. And
Management Studio.
That's what it's called.
There
right.
you go.
Sorry, I'm revealing my age again.
Yeah, you really
right.
are.
And
yeah,
that one's an old one.
Yeah, that's been gone since about 2005. Yeah, you're really showing your age over there.
Old habits die hard, right?
Yeah.
So I'm going to
Keyword being old.
True. As I mentioned earlier, I'm going to use a view to make my database administrator happy. And I'm going to key off that U.S. cities, which I showed you from the SQL Server tools. And when you want to define an external list, there are two operations you must define. You can see here that there are a number of different operations I can create and associations. I'm just going to go through two of these real quick so you get the idea of what is possible and how you do this. So you can see automatically it shows US cities read item as the name of this operation. And it's picked up the elements of my data source. In this case, they map to columns in a table, but they're from a view. And there's a warning down there at the bottom. It says at least one identifier should be specified. That's easy. The primary key of this table is geoname ID. I'm going to map that to be the identifier. I'm going to do that once again in the return parameter configuration screen. And then you can also see it's complaining that my population field is a 64, an int 64, which will not be displayed in the browser. I could map that if all the values fit within an int 32. But in this case, it may just be too big to show. All right, so now you can see on the right-hand side, I have a read item operation defined. And I can go in and create my read list operation. So the read list is going to be what's shown when you're viewing the list, like I did with the OData data source when I went to lists products. And then the read item is going to be when you go through to view the item details. And it's also going to be crawled by the search crawler. On the bottom, it says it's strongly recommended to add a filter of type limit for this operation. I will go ahead and do that. You change the filter type right here. You can see there's 5 different options. I'm going to choose limit, make it the default, and I'm going to set a default value of 1,000 items.
So that way, if you had, say, 50,000 items in that table, it's only going to give you back, in your case, 1,000. That way you're not just going to bombard SharePoint with a whole bunch of data.
That's right.
Okay.
And I'm going to, on this, on the read list, it says, it gives me a warning about the picker, right? So here, I can specify that I want the city name and the state to show up in a picker. If I didn't do that, it would just list out all of those fields, including the ID, which would not be very user-friendly. So now that I've done that, I can save this new system into my configuration database. And if I go I'm seeing the taskbar from my oh no, I'm in the right place. Okay, good. I auto-hid my taskbar on the desktop, but not on the server, and that was throwing me off. Okay, so now if I go into Central Administration, to a place we're all familiar from earlier modules, Managed Service Applications, which you saw in the search and the Managed Metadata. Well, this time we're going to go into the Business Data Connectivity Service. And here we can see my MVA BCS external content type that was created. There's a drop down here also for BDC models.
Yep.
And you can see that right now there isn't one yet. So if we go into Visual Studio and go back to the designer for an external content type and create a list, this is going to commit it commit the model. And you can see here when I'm creating an external list for the external content type, you also have the option to create an info path form.
Which is nice. So that way, if you want more customization over it, maybe add in a little bit of logic that could be used with it, you can do that very easily through InfoPath. And what's nice is that there are a lot of InfoPath designers that can help you spruce up, kick up the interface, make that look just that much better.
So it really does act in a lot of ways just like a list that you're used to working with in SharePoint, except for all the data is being pulled out of a different system.
Yep.
So now when I go ahead and do that, I can click through and I can look at the list and I get a login user failed. We can go to my central administration and fix that up real quick. there's a number of places where you want to look at permissions. One of them is here in sharing. You can see I'm logged in as SharePoint Administrator. SharePoint Administrator using Claims Administration shows up with this little identity here. And you can see that SharePoint Administrator has full control. And then, also from this screen, there's another place for permissions. And SharePoint Administrator, again, has full control. So if we drill through and look here, here's another place. Metadata. Propagate is probably what's missing here.
Yep, just make sure that it gets pushed down.
And then we can run that, that list again and see if we've hit the right permissions. Not yet.
Oh, I think that's happening in your database.
We can look in the database. That's another place to look.
So on the database itself?
Let me show you what it looks like in the database, because this is something you have to do. I did set this up ahead of time, but
actually, it's going to be for, I believe it's going to be for NT user is what it was showing as. So if you go back to the to your SharePoint screen,
okay.
go back to the browser.
Yeah. Okay, then let me go back to the model, because I think that's the model's not configured correctly in that case. Then SQL Server users. What I want to do here is actually use the BDC identity.
Okay.
So what's happening is it's not being passed in.
Right.
We're running into a what's called a double hop problem there.
Yep.
And so that was just a switch that needs to be set. Thanks for pointing that out. I didn't notice the username that was complaining about.
No worries.
It should be connecting as, I think I may have to redeploy it. So let me just go ahead and I'm going to delete the list and redeploy the list, and I think we'll be in good shape from there. So some of these things I'm doing in SharePoint Designer you can actually do in the browser. Some of them are just kind of easier. Some of the things you can only do. So I could create an external list from the browser, although I could not create the external content type from the browser. So let me do that again. I'll just make that unique, just in case. And there we've got our data coming straight from the SQL Server database. It's local. If I were to go into SQL Server Profiler, you would see this. This is live data. It's not being cached.
Right.
When I do the filtering, another query is going to be sent to the browser, to the server, and the querying, the filtering is actually going to be done on the fly there.
So even though the data looks like it's inside of SharePoint, it's still remaining inside of SQL Server.
That's right.
Excellent. Very cool.
Now, the one exception to that is, as you pointed out in search, with the in the search module about HR data and how there are certain things that are added to the index, right? Yep. And so then they're going to be in the index, right? When you crawl a BCS external content type, there's going to be some of the data stored in the index at that point. So you should be aware of that, just in case if somebody says, you know, nothing is ever cached. it kind of is in certain cases, right?
Yep.
I'm going to switch back to the slides now. And move on to the last module here, the external events and notifications. Now, once again, like the OData data source, external events and notifications are new to SharePoint 2013. And there's quite a lot here. I'm going to talk about the features, how you enable them, and some of the methods, and how you start subscriptions, and also talk about external list event receivers. So to start with, in SharePoint 2010, as I pointed out, external lists did not support alerts or event receivers. So this was often something that was asked about. You know, I've got a list, I can sort it, right?
Yep.
It really feels like a SharePoint list.
But it's not a SharePoint list. It walks like a duck, it quacks like it, but it's not really a duck. And it does wind up confusing users because you're looking for things like those alerts that if something changes, anywhere else inside of SharePoint, I can go in and say, hey, alert me, and I get a little email, but I don't get that with these.
Yes.
Yeah.
Now, there is a catch because now that SharePoint 2013 supports alerts and event receivers, now it's up to your external system to respond. Right? So
exactly.
This is a two-way process here.
Yep.
Right? Whenever you're going to talk about connecting to an external system and getting any kind of notification on the SharePoint side, there's some plumbing on the external system that's also going to be new.
Right.
And that's something to really watch out for. So anyway, these new operations in 2013 allow for three new things. One of them we talk about is alerts, so any user can go into an external list if this is set up properly and the plumbing's right on the other side.
Yep.
And they can be notified of new items that come up in the external system. The other thing we can do is use event receivers, and they go both ways, right? So we've got what we call event receivers and remote event receivers. And basically we're talking about either in SharePoint, in the normal way that we're used to using a list event receiver, we add one, right? And that's new. That wasn't able to be done in 2010 before. And then there's also the idea that the remote system can send SharePoint notification of an event that's happening on the remote system.
Yep.
So we talked about earlier OData, right? And when we're talking about enabling this external system to tell us about what's going on, what would have to happen on the OData side is you would now be implementing two new web service methods, HTTP methods, called subscribe and unsubscribe. And when you subscribe, when you send the data source the subscribe message,
Yep.
it must store that. It must have some way of saying, oh, look, Christopher asked to subscribe to this list.
Yep.
Maybe I should make a GUID or an ID or something, right? And write his name down and actually tell him
By
when
the way,
things
Christopher
happen.
wants, yes.
Yeah. So now there's nothing within SharePoint 2013 that really makes that magic happen on the other side, right?
Right.
It's totally
Yep.
up to you on the remote side to implement this storage and respond to this subscribe event, right? And similarly, you should return that ID for Christopher's new subscription to your external content type. You should return an ID so that later SharePoint 2013 can send the unsubscribe message. Because,
Yes.
you know, it's great to be alerted every time an item's added to a list until somebody starts adding hundreds and hundreds of items and you get 100 emails,
Well,
right?
not only that, sometimes, it's very interesting for right now because I'm working on a project, and then, after that completes, well, I really don't care anymore, so stop spamming me, I get enough email.
So, look out for this. Make sure that it's like Canned Spam Act. You gotta allow people to subscribe and unsubscribe, right? All right. So as I said, when the data changes, it's the responsibility of the external system to notify SharePoint of the changes, and the same event may trigger multiple subscription notifications. So Christopher could subscribe, I could subscribe,
Yep.
and we have to handle both of those, right?
Yep.
Or we have to handle hundreds of them. So you want to think about that
Yep.
in terms of throttling or something, right? So in order to do this, if you would like to have these alerts work on your site, there is a new feature in SharePoint 2013. And when you turn it on, it creates a new list to keep track of the subscriptions on the SharePoint side. So look for that there, enabled by activating the external subscriptions feature on the web, right? Which is also known as a site in some other terminology. Now, I mentioned earlier there were two new methods in the BDC model that allow this to happen, right? We implemented a read item and a read list method for both the OData data source and the SQL Server data source earlier in this module. These two new methods that you see on the screen, event subscriber and event unsubscriber, are new methods that must be defined within the model. And they have properties like the address of where the response to the notification should go is delivery address. The type of event is an add, update, delete, right? And again, like we said, the subscription ID, we want to know that. In addition, if it's an OData data source that you're connecting to, there are additional parameters that must be defined, the OData entity URL and so forth. Subscriptions can be created explicitly or implicitly. And explicit calls are made by programmatically, basically, right? Implicit calls are made when the user initiates it, right? So it's just like anything else we've been doing today. You can do it through the user interface, or you can do it through code. Right? Yep. So if I'm a user, I go up there, I create an alert. That's an implicit subscription, right? Yep. If I'm a developer, I go and I write code. That's an explicit subscription. And again, we talked about the methods, right? There's a subscribe method and an unsubscribe method. You got to keep track of that stuff, right? And here's an example of an explicit subscription through JavaScript client-side object model code. Notice in this case, I'm accessing an OData data source, or the Northwind sample database, right? Yep. And I am doing a lot of things we're used to seeing in the client-side object model code, right? Yep. I'm executing a query, I'm loading the payload, but also in this case, I've got some specific parameters which include, who's subscribing and what they're how we should notify them. And I've got you can see that LOB system instance. A lot of times the external system defined in the BDC model is also referred to in the XML itself as a line of business system, so otherwise known as an LOB system. So we've talked about how we subscribe and how we get notifications from the external system. And now I want to talk about the standard item added, item updated, and item deleted event receivers that we're used to calling on the SPList object in the API.
Exactly, yeah. So what this allows you to do is it allows you to be able to get event receivers with an app. So let's say that we are using Office 365 and we want to be able to deploy out an event receiver so somebody creates an item and maybe we need to write out a log or do something like that. Of course, we can't have any custom code inside of Office 365. And so that's where all of this comes into play, is that we can go in, we can set up our service, and actually be able to get event receivers with an app.
That's right. I mean, this is really powerful, right? Because Office 365 was developed to allow a broader adoption of SharePoint in general. And because of that, you've got millions of other people you're sharing your SharePoint farm with, potentially. And the full trust development model is really out the door when you think about that. Because in one line of full trust code, you could make everybody's day unhappy, right? And we don't want to be breaking other people's SharePoint environments, right? So the client-side object model allows us to do some really powerful stuff here in a safe way that's ready for our new cloud future, right? You can see here there's a lot of this is like you're used to with normal event receivers, but there is a new property called the external notification message. And this external notification message is what is sent back from your external data source, right? Mm-hmm. And it's going to be encoded, right? So in order for you to see the message on the other side, you're going to want to use this encoding.utf8.getString. Otherwise, it's going to look like
not going to be readable.
Gibbly goo. Here's an example of a remote event receiver on the on server-side code. So you're going to inherit, you're going to implement the SP item event receiver, and you're going to override the SP item event receiver's item added, just like a standard event receiver in SharePoint. And you're going to do the same things you would do with that item added event, except for this last line here, where you see that implementation of the encoding.utf8.getString wrapped around the property that's passed back from the external system there. So there you go. There you have it. I've got a few references for you to dig a little bit deeper into this if you'd like. There's a great video on the changes and features that goes into a little more detail on some other things on Microsoft.com. And these slides will be made available to you, so you can click through to those links. There's also, from a third party called Pluralsight, there's a great training video specifically on making the business data available in SharePoint 2013. And I'm a Microsoft Press author, so I have access to the whole catalog to do my research for these types of events. So that's kind of my go-to resource. And preparing for this talk today, for example, I looked at these three references. So SharePoint 2013 Inside Out is a book I co-authored. I didn't write that chapter 22, but the author did a great job. And specifically for the advanced information worker.
That was, wasn't that Penny Coventry?
That's right.
Yeah, she's fantastic.
She's awesome.
Yeah,
she's written books entirely on business connectivity services.
Yes.
They don't have a new one out yet for 2013. Their 2010 book just came out recently.
Yeah.
But she wrote this chapter 22 is from the advanced information workers. So it'll talk about the SharePoint Designer things I did, but not the Visual Studio things I did.
Exactly.
And go into more in depth. And it's a really, she is an expert on BCS, and she covers it very well. She's an excellent writer. On the developer side, there's a couple of references as well. The Microsoft SharePoint 2013 developer reference has one entire chapter on remote event receivers, so you can really dig deep into that. It's a new feature. It's not just for BCS. It applies to SharePoint development in general, so he covered that in one whole chapter. And then his chapter 14 is specifically about developing for business connectivity services. A new book just out, Inside SharePoint 2013, just this month, I believe, a few weeks ago. I'm not even sure. I think the print copies just started shipping. But they have also another great chapter where they talk about some of the new features in SharePoint 2013 and how you interact with business data catalog, business data connectivity models programmatically.
Yeah, that's the Ted Pattison book, and just came out. By the way, I do want to, because this came up in the chat, and I think this is a great question, that one of the things that we did here was we defined BCS. We talked about how all that works behind the scenes. We talked about how to set it up, connecting out to OData and so forth. We talked about, hey, you know what, this is cool. You know what we really didn't do is sort of set the stage as to why this is important.
That's true.
You know, and one of the things about SharePoint is when you're trying to explain SharePoint to somebody, analogous. It's very analogous to a database. That a database is just like a site, a table is just like a list. Everything is a list. Our rows are items, our columns are, well, columns. But that being said, SharePoint is not a database. One of the worst things that you can do to it is treat it like a database. So even though it's not a database, there is still going to be data that is inside of a database that my users are going to want to have access to. And that's where BCS really shines, is it makes it very easy for me to incorporate that external data that doesn't necessarily belong in SharePoint, but that my users still want accessible through SharePoint, and they want that interface. And to go one step further with this, BCS can also be utilized for search. You'll notice actually there's a lot of great changes to help ease some of the pain points that we had with search and BCS in the past. And you can also actually utilize BCS with user profiles and be able to import that into your user profiles as well. So those are some of the different scenarios. You've got that external data. You just want to make it available through SharePoint. Don't necessarily want it in SharePoint. This is where BCS shines.
You know, that's a great point, Christopher. I was in my zeal to get
Oh, yeah,
straight
absolutely.
to Visual Studio. I totally skipped over the huge value of BCS, and I've seen it over the years in clients I've worked with. One of the other ways that's it's really interesting you don't think of off the top of your head is supplementing user profile data. So,
Yeah.
for example, I worked with a large enterprise that keeps all their human resources data in an external system, say like PeopleSoft, right?
Okay.
Now, it turns
Like
out...
PeopleSoft.
It could have been PeopleSoft.
Well, you said say like PeopleSoft, so I said like PeopleSoft.
Oh, thank you.
You're welcome. See? I just do what I'm told to do. Sorry. Carry on.
So in something like PeopleSoft, you can store things. And then in the case of this enterprise, they had very rich data about the employees of the company that could help other people find them. For example, their cube number. Can you imagine?
That's kind of important.
Right? This building that this group works in is a mile long.
Yep.
Right? So think about it. If you said, oh, there's this guy who knows something. I found him in the employee directory.
He's somewhere out there.
He works in claims, I think. So they're, I think, in building A, right?
He's in charge of handling TPS reports.
Wouldn't it be great if you could incorporate into your user profile data when you go through People Search to find them?
Yep.
The guy's actual cube number,
Hey,
which you can find when you have the cube number, you can actually you can go directly to that guy's desk in this organization. So there is some hidden value that can be unlocked in your line of business systems in your enterprise through using BCS. It's a very powerful tool, and this was a very quick run through. There's an awful lot you can do with it. I just wanted to give you an example of some of the new things, some of the highlights of the new things in SharePoint 2013 that you can do with BCS.
Yep.
With that, I think we're about ready to wrap this module up and take another break.
Yeah, let's go ahead. We'll take 10 minutes, and we'll see you back here. And I'm feeling rather social. I don't know about you. Yeah.
How about it?
Let's do some social stuff. So we'll see you guys back here in 10 minutes.